We're finally onto the fun stuff. I know, there was a lot of tech and housekeeping to get through, but that's unavoidable. Being a colorist is a hybrid role, part creative and part hardcore technical. Now, we're going to go through the basics of a primary grade. So the first thing to explain is, what does a primary grade mean? It's simple, really. A primary grade is an adjustment that is not specifically targeted at a certain region of the image. That is to say, it affects the whole image. Primary grading is the first step of establishing a finished grade. It's when we set the contrast and manipulate the exposure of our image, fix color balance issues, and generally set the image in the best possible starting point. There are many cases, especially in simple grades and working on factual content, when a primary grade or a short sequence of primary grades will be enough to finish an image. There are many more cases where that is not true. A primary grade can have one of two goals: either to get the image to a good neutral place where a more detailed creative work can then be undertaken, or to get an image to a deliverable standard when working against a tight deadline. The foundations are extremely important, and we need to pay close attention to our primary grade to avoid compounding issues with our colour later in our project. So we're going to go through all the tools we use in the primary grade and then go through matching a short sequence with those tools. When you're ready, click on through to the next lecture. Okay, so it's about time we took our first steps into colour grading, and we're going to start right at the beginning of the primary grade. So, as we've already covered by now, the primary grade affects the entire image, and it's very often the foundational step of producing a finished look. In this lecture, we're going to look at how to set our primary contrast, and then in the following lectures, we will look at colour balance as well. So we're going to look at contrast, but also what we call global saturation here. And we do this by using the primary wheels in the lower left of the screen. These are here by default. If you don't see these wheels, then you have a different icon highlighted up here. Hit this crosshair, this little circular sniper scope looking thing here. You do not want the one with HDR. These are the HDR wheels, completely different. So here we have the primary wheels, and we want this white dot on the kind of center left highlighted. So the primary wheels allow us to work on the image, and they always affect the whole image, but they try to aim the majority of their effects within a corresponding part of our tonal range. We have lift, which is shadows, gamma, which is midtones, and gain, which is highlights. And offset will actually just pick up and lift the entire image or drop the entire image. You can see if I use the offset wheel, the scope reading just wholesale gets lifted up or down. So I want to start by setting my shadows. This is really important. Our perception of contrast works on the difference between values, light and dark, whether or not they're hue, saturated, desaturated. The shadows really anchor our image, so we do want to take care in setting our shadows. Now we'll go over contrast conventions for video and film looks later on. We're just going to work in the basic video style for now. I have a little horizontal slider underneath the color wheel for lift, and this is my luma slider. If I click and drag it to the right, I can make the corresponding part of the tonal range brighter. If I drag it to the left, I can make the corresponding part of the tonal range darker. And if I want to reset one of these wheels, towards the upper right of the wheel, there's a little reset button, which is a circular arrow. I'm going to start by setting my shadows. I'm going to drag this to the left until the lower part of the graph just about touches, but does not flatten out against, does not flatten out against the bottom of the graph. This kind of jump thing is a common issue in Resolve, so if you do that, just hit reset and go back. What it will do is it will suddenly jump kind of minus 0.8 to the left for no particular reason. It's a glitch that's been in there since version 15. So I'm just going to drag this down until I get some shadows there. That's fine. And I want to look at my image. If I kind of go down until things touch the bottom, then obviously this looks too dark. So I'm just going to drag it down there. That's about right. If we have color eyes on, the Luma waveform, the lower parts of the graph can begin to disappear as they go down towards the bottom because they become black, and then they become black on the chart as well, which means they appear to disappear. So sometimes if I turn colorize off, I get a much better view of the bottom of my chart. And there we go, that's properly set shadows for a video style look. Setting our shadows is the first step. Well, what I want to do next is set my highlights. Now the highlights we have to think about a little bit, and we want to think about where they go. Typically, most reflected highlights, and we will talk about the difference between reflected and emitted highlights in more detail later on, but a reflected highlight is any object reflecting light towards the camera, whereas an emitted highlight is any highlight where it's a practical light or the sun or clouds, things which are shining light directly at you, are emitting light. Reflected highlights don't typically go above 896 on the scope. I've got this little super bright thing, and that's a little look on that's that white strike on his shorts there. I can bring that down with the curves later on. In a few lectures time we'll deal with that. So I've got my other highlights around 896. So that's about where I want to be. Once we have our shadows and our highlights set, I want to set my midtones. And I'm going to bring my midtones up because this isn't a moody piece. This is quite a light-hearted film. So that's looking a little bit better. And I can tackle these kind of blown out bits with the curves later on. So this is a basic example of setting contrast with the primary color wheels. I just click and drag the sliders underneath these here. We have more different controls like shadows and highlights and contrast. We will cover those in a different lecture. For now, I want us to focus on the primary wheels. These are the easiest way in, and I still use these more than any other tool in Resolve. They're the absolute bread and butter of image work in Resolve. The last thing I'm going to do is underneath gain, there's a little control that says saturation. I'm going to click on that and drag it to the right until I think the image looks more convincing. Resolve operates in what's called YRGB color space. We will deal with that in detail later on. But basically, as we stretch out our contrast, the image appears to lose saturation. Technically it doesn't, technically it stays the same, but it appears to lose saturation. To remedy this, we drag the saturation value down here up until we're happy with the image. And now I've got my basic primary grade. I've taken it from log gamma to something approaching a video style looking Rec 709. Now if you want to see before and after of your entire grade, hold Alt or Option and hit D. And that will toggle your entire grade off and on. So this is how we set our basic contrast using the primary wheels. So what I want you to do is go through the first 4 shots and do the same here. Be careful with the bridge shadow. What we don't want is for things to kind of go flat black and lose detail like this. This is called crushing the shadows, when the shadows flatten out against the bottom of the chart. So I'll just bring it down a bit there. We don't always want our shadows to touch the bottom of the graph, because if we have big black shadows like this, we just have a big flat black kind of splodge on the screen, and we always want to preserve as much detail as we can. I will then go up with my highlights. Now if something doesn't naturally hit 896, we won't force it. So we'll go up until we think it's right, and then we will also bring up the gamma. Once I've brought up the gamma, I may want to drop my shadows a bit more again. It's completely okay if that's the way we want to do this. And then global saturation up. And we want a kind of live action cartoony look here. So this is a good first step. So go ahead, first 4 shots of the short sequence scene, detect, edit. Shot number 3 is problematic. It had completely different camera settings, so for now, get it into a good place. It will look different from all the other shots because we haven't matched the color balance between these yet. Shot 3 we will deal with in detail in the longer how to grade a short sequence using primaries and secondaries at the end of this section and the next. So go ahead, first 4 shots, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, so we have contrast down. So in this lecture we're going to take a look at color balance. Now at the top of this section in the module asset download info, there's a link that gives you a series of TIFF stills. These stills up here, which all have different problematic color casts on them, and we have to fix them for this exercise. So I can just click and drag them in, I can bring them in, and once I've done that, I'm bringing them into a dedicated bin. I will right click that bin and choose create new timeline using selected bin. Just like last time, just like we did with the scene cut detector. I'm going to call this one stills and hit create, and then we can go straight on to the color panel. So we have a series of color casts that we need to fix here, and these stills are taken from 2 future projects further on in the course. I thought it would be good to have a preview of what we have to deal with. So let's take a look at how we fix a color cast, and let's take a look at how we read the scopes whilst doing so. Now the first thing I need to do is I need to bring up my parade scopes. If we have work to do like this, if we have to solve color casts, we should be looking at the parade scopes. So let's take a look at what we have. Clearly a very red image. Warm color casts are my least favorite. I just think they don't look good, usually because it makes it harder to pick the skin tones out from the background, because everything then becomes kind of warm and orange colored. Actors just don't stand out that way. We lack contrast with a warm color cast usually. I can see in my red channel that my shadows are much higher in my red channel than in my green or blue channels. So I can now see that my red cast is in my shadows. That's what this tells me. This bit is higher than the others. The highlights are more or less clean, actually. Maybe a little bit cyan in the highlights, but the shadows are very red because the lower part is much higher up in the red channel than it is in the green or the blue. So let's talk about how we neutralize a color cast. We neutralize a color by adding its complementary color to it. That's how we neutralize colors in RGB color space. Now the explanation for this, pixels have red, blue and green values. We call this an RGB triplet value. And if all 3 colors are the same, we have a true neutral color. Now the complementary color is basically the missing color or colors from the pixel. If I have a pixel with just red in it, its complementary would be an even mix of blue and green, which makes cyan. If I have a cyan pixel, it's just missing red. If we add the missing color in, what we do is we make all of the RGB values the same, and that neutralizes the color cast. In practice, it's much simpler. In practice, if we have a color cast, we go to the corresponding part of the tonal range, the corresponding wheel here, and I can identify that this color cast is in my shadows. So I grab this little dot in the center of my crosshair, and if I move that around, as I move it towards different colors in the color wheel, I'm adding those colors to the image. But the easiest way of thinking about this is I drag this away from the color I want to neutralize and remove. And I do that until my red, green and blue bases line up on my parade graph. So I can see that I've got red, orange. Oh look, there's red, orange. I'm just going to drag the target away from them. And over time you just build up a muscle memory as to what kind of moves over here produce what kind of differences in the graph over there. So that's quite simple. We drag away from a color we want to neutralize in the frame. That's the easiest way of dealing with this. So let's take a look at the next one. This looks like, well, there's definitely blue in the shadows and a little bit of red. So we've got a slightly magenta cast in our shadows here. We're going to start mixing colors. So blue and red equals magenta. Red and green equals yellow. Blue and green equals cyan. The hair's a little bit purple on this shot, and everything looks a little bit purple. Purple can be a very problematic color cast because magenta and purple are the least common naturally occurring colors. That's not to say that they don't exist. Some people say that magenta light does not actually exist. There's an argument for that we're not going to get into right now because it's a pointless argument, to be perfectly frank. It's a very unnatural looking color cast to have pretty much across the board. Unless you're going for something very stylized, it's not a good idea. So I can establish I've got purple. I therefore want to drag away from purple, which happens to be towards green. And I just keep going until it levels out across the bottom there. And addressing a color cast with primaries is this simple. I've got a blue push here. We often refer to color casts as either excursions or push. A blue push is a blue tint, a red push is a red tint. So this one looks a little bit blue in the mids and a little bit blue in the highlights. So I can just push away from blue, which happens to be towards yellow. And I can just warm it up a little bit. And there we go. And then I can see the difference. That was very blue. And now that's a bit more neutral. We still have some blue highlights on this man's kind of gelled hair here. That's because in this shot we are mixing daylight and tungsten. And I'm sure, as anyone with a basic knowledge of lighting knows, if we color balance to tungsten, daylight looks blue. If we color balance to daylight, tungsten light looks orange. If we mix the two in a shot, we have to perform a secondary to fix that. We're not going to do that here. We're going to do secondaries in the next section of the course, so don't worry about that for now. So by now, we can go through and we can look at the color casts we have in these images. I've got magenta in here. What I can do... Now, that wall is a little bit blue. And then I can just cool down the mids ever so slightly and maybe take a little bit of blue out the shadows. And there I've got a reasonably neutral image as well. Maybe those highlights look a little bit green, so I can push slightly more towards magenta, get rid of those. So this is just the basic idea. What we do is we look at the image. Okay, this clearly has a magenta push. It pretty much looks to be in the highlights. You can see, you know, we've got pretty high red and blue up here and lower green. That indicates highlights and midtones. So then we just start making these adjustments until we get a more neutral image. So your task is to finish the job. You've got shot 5 and shot 6 to work on. Remember, at this point it's just easy enough to think we're dragging the target away from the color we want to neutralize in the frame. You have to look at your shot, you have to look at your parades, you have to think, where is my push, where is my color cast? And then you have to take appropriate action in order to neutralize it. We drag the target away from the color we want to neutralize, which just so happens to be adding its complementary color to it, thus neutralizing the color cast. So go ahead and finish off shots 5 and shot 6, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. So we're done with the primary wheels. Now we're going to use the primary RGB or custom curve. So if you don't see the curve in the lower center of your screen like this, you will have to click this icon here, which is a grid with the letter S going through it, and this will expose the curves interface. If you have a smaller screen, what you may find is that you only have one set of tools visible down here, and all of these icons on this kind of middle bar are towards the center. That means that you can only see one set of tools, so you're still just looking for this grid icon in order to see the curves. Now, anyone familiar with Photoshop will know what this does. This allows me to draw a curve in order to remap the values of an image. The bright values are towards the right and the dark values are towards the left. I can click on any point on this line, and if I drag up, I'm making the corresponding values brighter, and if I drag down, I'm making the corresponding values darker. What is really useful, and this came in Resolve version 16 quite a while ago now, are the histograms beneath the curve. Now, a histogram is just a graph of value and frequency of which that value occurs. The higher the chart, the more pixels you have with that particular value. Now, with that, the higher points on this histogram tell me that I have a lot of pixels with these brightness values here. So if I move the curve around over the histogram, over the highest point of the histogram, I'm going to have the largest visible impact because I'm going to be changing the brightness of the largest number of pixels. Likewise, if I don't have many pixels which are this bright, I'm not doing a great deal. I'm just really going to be hitting the road markings and the very bright part of the road in the background there. So we can kind of use the histogram to chart out the parts of the image that we want to work on. Now, this image has a problem. The road markings in the back are overexposed. They're too bright. And because of that, they're distracting. They're the brightest thing in the image. And when we are presented with contrast, we naturally gravitate towards things which are brighter, warmer coloured, and more saturated. That's kind of just how the eye prefers things. So bright things, saturated things, and warmer coloured things tend to proceed into the foreground. Dark things, desaturated things, and cool coloured things tend to recede into the background. So I need to make sure that this background element of the road markings here is not too distracting. Now, before I do any crazy stuff with this curve, I want to hit this chain icon here. This is the unlink or ungang icon, and it's always better to do this and work on brightness separate from red, green or blue, and then work on the individual color channels later on. So what this does is it unlinks the curves. If it is active, I move all 4 curves at once, Y, which is brightness, then red, green and blue. More on those in the next lecture. And if I unlink this, you'll see I move only one curve, and it actually leaves the red curve alone, and I can move all 4 curves individually to make adjustments to my image. And this is the best way to work with the curves most of the time. So I'm going to hit the chain, unlink my curves, make sure I have Y, which is brightness, active, and now we're just working with brightness. Now I'm going to left click just about here. If I take a look at my scope, I can see I have some peak readings here. I have some spikes. This one near the center is the signpost around the back, and to the right I have this reading here, which is clipping at the top. And this represents my road markings. And this is the part of the image that I want to work on. Now, when a highlight is so bright that it hits the top of the charts and it flattens out, it's called clipping. And crushing is when a shadow is so dark that it hits the bottom of the chart and it flattens out. So if I make things darker here, you'll see things start to hit the bottom of the Luma waveform, and we start to get a lot of pure solid black in our image. Clipping and crushing values like this destroy detail, because detail can only be perceived through contrast. If all of the values are the same, we get a flat colour, therefore the detail is lost. So we want to, generally speaking, we want to avoid clipping and crushing unless we are doing it for creative effect. But we'll go through the logic behind that thinking later on. For now, I just want to fix these road markings. Now I'm going to click and place a point here, and I'll give you a trick to use with the curves. If we draw a horizontal line over to our Luma waveform, that's the part of the waveform that's going to be affected by moving this point. If I move it up and then draw the horizontal line, it stays aligned. Likewise if I move it down. So if you're really looking to work on a particular part of your tonal range, just drag your cursor across horizontally and see where these points line up on the curve. Now, as it happens, I mainly want to work with this bit here. So I'm going to drag this point up so that it's horizontally aligned with about 896 on my scope. And then I can drag this part down. And you'll notice that I'm bringing this down, but everything else is getting brighter because the curve kind of bends when we make corrections like this. I can fix this by clicking and placing a second point, and then just smoothing out the curve, and then I can just bring this down. And I don't want it to look silvery and unnatural, but then I can just bring this down, and now that road marking is not so distracting. We have a quite bright, saturated, warm feature in the main lead actor's face right here. And this is a very, very common adjustment to make with the curves, especially the Luma curves, is bringing clipped highlights back under control. You'll probably do this a lot when you shoot the sky and you get clouds, because clouds are very often blown out around the edges because the sun is shining through them. So, as we've just seen, the curves are good for more targeted things. There are those who use the curves instead of the wheels. I don't do that. I like the wheels. But if you can get everything you want out of the curves, then that's fine. You can work like that if you so choose. It just so happens that my favourite way to use these is to fix individual little details that I can target using them. And this is a very standard shape of curve that we're seeing right here to deal with problematic blown out highlights, as we've just said. So that's a nice example of using the curves. Now what I can do is I can reset this. There's a circular arrow in the upper right of the tool window. This will reset the curves, and this will also reset the wheels. So let's go ahead and make a primary adjustment on this shot using just the curves. Now, a standard way of doing this is to introduce an S-curve, and that darkens the shadows and boosts the highlights, and that is a general kind of set your shadows, set your mids, set your highlights. In this shot, an S-curve isn't going to work as well because it's already quite dark. And what you see is we've got some quite harsh details down here. And we've got a problem with setting some proper highlights and some proper shadows as well using just an S-curve, because you'll see you get a lot of things kind of squeezing down in the waveform here and up at the top as well without actually hitting the top. So what I want to do to set my shadows and my highlights with a curve is I want to grab the leftmost point, and this is for shadows, and drag it in. And that is basically saying, right, any value to the left of this point now is being treated as absolute black. So I drag that in. And the trick is if we drag it in just to the leftmost side of the histogram, I'm going to start setting some nice core black values. And then I can do the same with the highlights. And then I can start playing around with the rest of the tonal range. So I'm going to bring my mids and my highlights up because this is quite a dark shot. I might not have such harsh shadows. And then I can start with the saturation. Now you always need quite a bit of saturation when working with the curves, usually a bit more than when you're just working with the wheels, because when you separate the brightness out, saturation behaves a little bit differently. We won't go right into that just now, but I want to bring the saturation up. And I might just try and introduce a slight S-curve down here, get a little bit more out of the shadows, but I'm wary of things looking too black or too harsh or too dark. So I think that just adds a bit of contrast without going too far. So that's a decent first pass at a primary grade using just the curves. So that pretty much covers our use of the curves. There's one last little bit of cautionary advice I want to share with you, and that's that when we use the curves, the trick is to keep everything as smooth as possible. We want nice, smooth, rolling curves going between these points. Because if I start to introduce lots of micromanagement and lots of zigzaggy stuff down here, what you see is we almost start to introduce hard edges and things that look like noise. And this is because we're making two adjacent values very, very different to each other and giving them very, very high contrast. And that creates issues like this. So we want to make sure that our curves are kind of smooth and rolling between the points, and we get a nice transition from one value into the next, and we get a nice natural looking image. So have a go at shots 5, 6 and 7, but use the curves instead of the wheels this time. So go ahead and have a bit of a practice, and once you're ready, click on through to the next lecture. Okay, so I'm back to the color cast stills again, and this time we're going to take a look at them using the curves instead of the wheels, because we can carry out individual R, G, B, red, green and blue adjustments with them as well. I'm going to make sure I've got my parade scopes active down here. Just click the drop down and choose parade if you do not. And let's start looking at this. So like last time, I'm going to click the chain link, and now I've got my Y, R, G and B. I can work on any one of the 3 color channels or the brightness option here. Now I've got a lot of red in this image, so I'm going to start working on the red curve. I have too much red in my shadows. So what I can do is I can click this leftmost point and I can drag it in, and you can see that that is dropping the red, which has the effect of simultaneously raising the blue and the green. And I can just keep pulling this down here until my shadows level out and I get a more neutral image. In this image, I want to pay attention to the brown hair on the left-hand side here. That can sometimes stay a little bit too warm, even if the rest of the image looks good. So that's fine there. And that's pretty much the same as dragging the shadow wheels down towards cyan and away from red. But I can go one further. The skin tones are typically in the middle. And if I look at this face here, I've got a red reading on my scope of around 512, and it peaks a little bit just right of the center. This reading here is the right-hand side, or the screen right-hand side of this actress's face. So what I could do is I could just push a little bit of red into the skin tones. So I'm going to just feel it out and see where the skin tones are, and I can start to push some red in there. Now you see I can go too far, but this does show how accurate this modification can be. You see how I'm basically just hitting the skin and a little bit of the wall back there. So I might just want to do this very, very slightly, and that can help keep the skin tones warm even if I've cooled down everything else. Now the curves are good at doing this kind of thing. This is a basic skin tone adjustment. We're going to be really looking at how we work on skin tones later on in the course, but it's good to be aware of some of the more basic techniques just now. But the curves can target different parts of the tonal range with quite a lot of accuracy. It's a nice little technique to be aware of. So I'm going to continue to the next shot. This one has a magenta cast, so I'm going to go into the green option here on the curves. I only have red, green and blue in the curves, so the last shot was easy. I just had to work on red. But in this case, I have to work on both red and blue. I may have to work across 2 curves in order to fix this. I might not just be able to work on the green curve here. But what I can do is drag the green dots up, and that will get me part of the way there. So if I have higher red and higher blue, I can drag my green shadows up, and that gets me part of the way there. Now, using just green, you can see how it's impossible to get this image neutral. I can get red and green level, and that's about the best I can do with the green curve here. The shade of purple that's in this image is not an equal mix of red and blue. There is more blue than red, and the scopes back this up. We can see when we balance green and red together, blue is still too high. So the green curve alone cannot do this job, and this is why I prefer to use the color wheels, because I can go for all kinds of intermediary hues, whereas here it's a bit more limiting. I'm using just red, green or blue with the RGB curves. So now I'm going to click over to the blue channel, and I just want to bring it over to the right. I want to take my shadows just under control here, and I want to bring this down until I get my shadows neutral and low, and behold, I have a much more neutral image now. So I had to work across two different channels for this one. If I've got a colour that isn't pure red, pure cyan, pure green, whatever, it's a bit less practical to do it this way. And that is why I do like to work with colour wheels most of the time. Like I've said, my favourite use of the curves is to do little targeted things with them. It's not to use them for my basic primary grading purposes. I prefer the fact that they can target parts of the image, and I just like to work with them like that. If you find that the curves are something you like to work with during your primary grade, that's absolutely fine, that's perfectly valid. There's no rule anywhere which states you have to use wheels, you have to use curves. Whatever works for you is valid in this practice. So, this one might be a little bit easier with the curves, because rather than just guessing between the three different parts of the tonal range, we can kind of feel it out. I can see that I've got a blue cast here, and if I look at my parade, my shadows are maybe a little bit yellow, lower blue down here, but generally the blue wave is elevated compared to the other two, even though the highlights aren't that badly out of whack. So it looks like highlights and it looks like mostly upper mids here. And that, with the wheels, could be a little bit awkward to kind of zero in on and get just right. So what I can do is I can just start to pull this down, and I can just kind of work on this and I can feel it out until things start to look a little bit better. Now I want to avoid the back of the shirt here going green, because if I do that, it's going to start looking weird. And what I might do is bring my global saturation up a little bit, because when we address a colour cast, sometimes the image can look a little bit washed out. So I might just push the saturation up. That brings the warmth in this guy's skin back over there, and it stops them from looking too pale, which is generally a good thing. So this is a much easier way of working with these curves. Now there is a little bit more. These highlights, maybe I'll do a secondary later on, but this blue curve here has helped me make a big difference to this shot, as we can see. Before and after. That's mostly there. I might do something about this guy's hair later on because I don't like how blue the highlight is, but other than that, it looks pretty good. So this one was easy enough to do with a curve, but again, I like doing little targeted things, and that's just how I like to use the curves. And this is essentially the same logic as using the color wheel. Let's say, for example, I'm looking at a magenta cast. I look at that and go, oh, it's magenta. What's the opposite of magenta? It's green. So I'll start working in the green curve, and I'll start bringing stuff up. And fairly quickly, we'll start to see this image take shape and become neutralized. So it's just about developing that eye. Again, if you want to work with the curves, an easy way to do this is to start with the wheels. Look at the image. Let's go back to the start. This is magenta. Okay, opposite of magenta is green, therefore the green curve is what I want to use here. If I go back to this image, this is kind of a bluish purple, so I'm going to want to work with green but also the blue curve. So I want you to go ahead and work on the next 3 shots of this contributor here, this guy here, and this actress here. Now in these two, obviously the green curve is going to be involved. It's not just the green curve on the final shot, but the big challenge here is, remember, you have to keep the skin tones intact and looking good as you solve this color cast, and we've already covered how you might do that with the curves. So go ahead and fix these shots, this time using the curves predominantly, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, we're going to look at what we call the log wheels. And they can be quite useful, but they have a very specific function and a very specific way of doing things. First, I need to expose my log wheels. By default, you have the primary color wheels exposed, and I have these three icons in the upper right of the wheels window: a target, 3 bars, and log. The target is the primary color wheels, currently exposed. The bars are the RGB corrections. Here we can work entirely within the red, green, or blue channels, or with the brightness channel, not unlike we did beforehand with the curves. And then the third one along is log, and these are the log wheels. Now, the log wheels are kind of an odd cross between the accuracy of the curves and the kind of general function of the wheels. The log wheels allow me to manually define what is a shadow, what is a midtone, and what is a highlight, and then work within those manually defined regions of the tonal range. I don't do a lot of basic primary stuff with them. I tend to, like with the curves, use them for quite targeted adjustments. So we'll just quickly go over how to expose them again. It's the icon up here in the upper right of the wheels window, or the primary tools window, that says log, and here they are. Now, just below these icons, I have pivot, lower range, and upper range. And lower range starts at 0.333, so that's about a third of the way up the graph. Anything below this range will be acted on by the shadow wheel. Now, we have these 3 decimal places here. These essentially map on to the values we see in the right-hand side in our scope. So for 333, anything below 333, roughly, on the scope will be impacted. Now these actually go up to 1, not 1.023, so there's a very slight difference in the way that they scale, but more or less this number here is the cutoff point on the scope. So if I go to range 0.384 for lower, and I can just click and drag, or I can type in, and then I can move the shadow wheel around, you can see that it pretty much stops being acted upon around 384, very slightly above, because again we go up to 1.023 or 1023 here and only go up to 1 on these wheels, but it is more or less what you're doing. So I can define my lower range, and anything below the lower range is acted upon by the shadow wheel. Anything above the high range is acted upon by the highlight wheel, and anything in between the 2 ranges is acted upon by the midtone wheel. So if I put high range to, let's say, 640, 0.64, and then you can see that I'm working with only the very brightest values in the image. And then if I start moving the midtones around, you can see that the very brightest stuff on the forehead isn't touched and the shadows are left alone, but the midtones are acted upon. So I've got a problem with this image. The highlights on the actress's skin here are kind of pale and silvery looking, and these don't look too healthy. Silvery highlights on the skin can be a common problem. Generally speaking, skin highlights are not pure white, and if they are pure white, they can make an actor look a bit pallid and ill. So I want to try and fix these pale highlights on this actress's skin. And what I can do to get a good view of this is I can just use the scroll wheel to scroll in, and then I can middle click to drag it around. I can also hold Alt and hit F to expand the viewer, and now I can reposition this image so I get a good view of what I'm working on these silvery values on the actress's skin here. So I want to bring my upper range down to where we are, about to, let's say, kind of 0.65. And that's roughly good here. I'm defining these silvery values as a highlight. So now what I can do is I can add a bit of orange or warmth into these highlights. And if I push it too far, you can see what we're doing. But a little bit of warmth into these highlights, and we can begin to see now how they mesh into the skin tones better. So I can add these and maybe bring these down very slightly. There we go. And now, before and after, we've gotten rid of those kind of silvery highlights on the actress's skin, and the skin is looking a lot more healthy now. Now, one of the problems we can have with overexposed skin is that the red channel can clip in the skin highlights, in which case we just want to use this wheel to kind of cool them down a little bit. Now, if I look over here, I do have some very high red values, so maybe these warm highlights are a little bit too warm at the moment. Generally speaking, the highlight rule applies to skin, but for different channels. The red part of the skin, under most circumstances, doesn't go far above 896, and you can see my highlights are a little bit high up here, so I do want to cool this down a touch. And the green part of the skin, generally speaking, doesn't go above 768. So we can bring this down a little bit more, and then I can give myself a bit more space. And there we go. I can bring myself, give myself a little bit more space just to fix these skin tones. And now these kind of silver streaks on the skin are much better integrated into the actress's other skin tones. We're going a little bit over 768, that's okay. We don't need to hit 896 for red, and the green can just go over 768 a little bit because we do have quite a bright highlight there. But this is a big improvement over now. We've got much more natural looking skin here. So that's dealing with skin highlights with the log wheels. It's something I do quite a bit of with these tools. I will show you another trick we can carry out with the log wheels that we call an undertones grade. So what I can do is I can go back to my primaries wheels, and I can add a little bit of cyan into the shadows, generally cool things down a bit. Now this isn't great because we've elevated our core blacks. They're quite blue, they're not neutral anymore, they don't give that image a kind of neutral grounding anymore. But we can keep the impact of this color cast, and we can bring our core blacks back to being neutral using the log wheels. So I'll go back to the log wheels, and I want to bring my range, my lower range, right down. I'm going to say maybe 0.90 or 0.1. That's 0.09. Let's try that. And now, what I want to do is I want to neutralize these very dark shadows. And I want to bring that up a bit more. And what I can then do is I can maintain the impact of the color cast that I've introduced, but I can keep my core blacks and my shadows neutral and black, and I can keep that kind of grounding effect they have on the image. And this is giving it a kind of modern thriller vibe, I guess, slightly cyan, slightly sickly looking. And you can see how this does begin to change the atmosphere of the shot quite a bit. Now, this doesn't look fantastic here. It's predominantly a warm shot, and trying to introduce a cool color cast into a warm shot is a losing battle because the warm and cool colors will fight with each other and it'll go kind of neutral and pasty looking. But this is just an example of this trick we can carry out using the log wheels. So I'm going to reset my wheels here and it will go back to the way it was. But that's essentially what I use the log wheels for. They are intended to grade log images with high accuracy, but I find the primary wheels are great for that anyway, and I use the log wheels in much the same way that I use the curves. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now, before we charge on and go into matching our short sequence, we need to take a look at what is arguably our most powerful tool in making sure our grades are matching up, which is the stills gallery. The stills gallery contains still images extracted from our grade and organizes them into albums or folders. We can perform a grade, capture a still image, and then use that still image as a reference when matching two shots up later, or copy the entire grade or part of that grade over. We're going to take a look at how to use it. So here's a grade that I've performed, and so far it's okay, basic primary stuff. We just need to make sure that the whole sequence matches. We need to be sure that we don't get any jarring shifts in brightness or colour balance as we watch through it. Now the shot's alright, but oh dear, and it gets even worse. Well, hey. Now we need to match all these shots together, and just flicking back and forth between them whilst we're working is not the best way to do that. What I want to do now is I want to go back to my first shot, which I know is graded correctly, and I want to be sure that the gallery is active. And if you cannot see the gallery on the left-hand side of the screen, go to the upper left and click the gallery icon, and it will expose the stills gallery in the upper left of the screen. Now I want to right-click or control-click within the viewer and choose Grab Still. Notice this generates a still image and places it in the gallery to the left. Now, if I go ahead and mouse over this still image, weird stuff begins to happen. The clip might begin to play. If I'm on a different clip, the colour will change and the clip will begin to play as I mouse over it. And this is down to some settings that may or may not be on by default in your version of Resolve. This is called Live Preview and Hover Scrub Preview. Now, scrubbing refers to dragging a playhead around in order to play a clip. And if I mouse over this still, it's going to scrub the clip I'm currently on. Fortunately, this no longer causes us to lose our place. In older versions of Resolve, it actually moved the playhead around and caused us to lose our place when doing this. But this feature has been very, very annoying for a lot of people. So let's go over how to turn it off and get a bit more control over it. Now, there are two parts to this. There is the live preview and the hover scrub preview. The live preview is what's making the color change. The live preview is telling us what will our current clip look like if we were to paste the grade in our currently selected still onto it. That's what we're seeing. What would happen if I took the grade from this shot and pasted it on here? Because this still image, it's not just a still image that's a reference image. It also contains a copy of the color grade taken from the shot at the time we took the still. So, not only can this be a reference image, we can also paste the grade from this still directly onto our current shot. And we're seeing a preview of what would happen if we do that here. The second part is hover scrub preview. And that's what's making the clip play. This is the most annoying one. I generally like to leave live preview on, but I change hover scrub preview to thumbnail. Thumbnail and viewer will make the viewer change. Thumbnail will just make the thumbnail play. And it can be useful just to have a loose indication of what the grade will look like. We also have a zoom slider up here in the gallery. So I can make these stills bigger, and then I can scrub and get a loose idea of how well the shot might take the grade within the still. And it currently looks pretty good, honestly. So that's how to take control of these features. You can just turn live preview off and that will disable the hover scrub, that will disable live preview. I do like to keep live preview on, but I don't want hover scrub preview in the viewer. That I find very annoying. So now, let's take a look at how we might actually make use of this still. I'm going to shrink it back down a bit with the zoom bar. So what I can do is I can either copy and paste the grade directly onto the shot. I can right click, apply grade, and that will overwrite the grade I have currently on the shot. That will overwrite everything, so we want to be careful when we do that. Or I can use it as a reference image and I can grade manually to match, which most of the time is the best choice. And I do that by right-clicking and choosing Play Still. Used to be the Play Still option was in the viewer, now it's actually on the still in the gallery. Now, what happens is we get a split screen, or we get a wipe, showing the reference image over the current clip we are working on. Now I can left-click and I can drag to manipulate this wipe to show different parts of the reference image and different parts of the clip we're working on. And in the upper part of the viewer, these icons here change the wipe mode. By default it's horizontal, but we can go vertical, we can go diagonal, and then we can go weird things, like we can get a kind of crossfade version. A mix, alpha isn't going to be useful most of the time. Difference, I've never used. Picture-in-picture, Venetian blinds, and checkerboard, truly bizarre. Never used any of those in 10 years of doing this. Most of the time, horizontal is fine. Every now and again, vertical. Vertical can be useful if you have a shot with two contributors on either side of the frame, because horizontal will always block one of those out, and vertical lets you see the top half of both of them, so you can get a good idea of how to match skin that way. But that's the only real time I would change these wipe modes, and like I said, these weird ones, I've never used them, so don't worry about them. So now, I'm basically just working on this shot, but I can see a reference image. I can just bring this up a little bit to match. And just set my shadows, and now I've got a much better match here. Maybe the saturation could be a touch high. There we go. So now I want to get rid of my still and watch my clip. In the upper left of the viewer, there's this split screen icon. This is the image wipe icon. We just click that to turn off our still. Now let's see how these two clips play into each other. And that's a much, much better match. I always like to save whenever I've made a successful match like that, so just in case there's a crash or whatever, I don't lose any work. So that's the first way of using a still. The second way is, as we've already covered, simply to copy it over, and I can right click and apply grade, or I can simply middle click or mouse wheel click on either a still or a shot in the timeline. I can right click and I can choose apply grade from a shot in the timeline as well. So whilst you don't need to take a still in order to copy grades across, cataloguing your looks, cataloguing your work is actually quite useful. Because whilst you're working, it's useful to have stills of an old grade on standby in case a client changes their mind and you have to start rolling back on certain shots. And believe me, that does happen. And also, if a client wants to see the difference between two versions or two passes of the grade, this can be a useful way to show that as well. Now there's one more thing to go over, which is how to share stills between projects. By default, a still remains in the project in which it was grabbed or taken, but we can move a still into a more permanent place by making it into what we call a power grade. A power grade is basically a still, but it's available in the power grade albums, and in turn, those albums are available across all of the projects you have on a particular database. If you have more than one database, then the power grades will only appear in one of them, not all of them, and it corresponds to the project and its database when you took the still and converted it into a power grade. So if you've done something that you really like and you want to try using it in another project, then just click and grab the still and drag and drop it into the power grade album. Then, if we were to go to another project, open up the gallery and go to the power grade album, we would just see that still right here, and we can see any other stills we've taken and saved as power grades as well. So this was a good introduction to the stills gallery. It's a tool you will be using constantly, so make sure you have a go. Grab some stills, then bring them up as references. It's really important to use stills as a reference to match the grade as you work and prevent what we call creep, which is when a grade appears to change over the course of a project. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. So far, we've kept all of our work to a single node, and whilst we're just picking up the tools, that's fine. But in any real-world project, we're going to have to start organising our grade in the node tree to get an image to where we want it to be. On the upper right of the screen here, we've got the node tree. There are a few basic things to note down first. The node tree essentially shows us a chart of our original source image, all the colour transforms it goes through, and then how that goes through to the final output, which in most cases is what we see in the image viewer in the centre of the screen. The green dot on the left-hand side here is our RGB input. This is essentially our base image. It's what we've imported into Resolve, and it's the clip we currently have active in the timeline, the clip that we're working on. We then have a line that travels from our RGB input to our first node, and believe it or not, some people call this a noodle. We then have another noodle going from our first node to our second node, and then finally a noodle going from our second node all the way to our RGB output on the right side of the node tree. What this is telling us is that our base image is going through two sets of colour transforms that are stored in nodes 1 and 2, and then the resulting image is being passed through to our RGB output, and as a result we are seeing that new image in our viewer. Now, the first node we have here is the most simple kind of node in Resolve, and it's the one we're going to be working with almost constantly. It's called a serial node. A serial node contains a series of colour transforms or adjustments, applies them to the image that it receives through its own RGB input, which is the green triangle on the left-hand side, and then passes it out through its own RGB output, which is the green box on the right-hand side, either to another node or all the way through to the RGB output on the far right of the node tree. As long as serial nodes simply progress from left to right, they act in much the same way as adjustment layers on Photoshop stacked on top of each other. Each subsequent version of our image, resulting from the adjustments performed by each node, is then subject to a new set of adjustments. This process continues until the image is passed through to our main RGB output and we see the resulting image in the viewer in the center of our screen. Putting this into practice, we have two serial nodes here. The first is our primary contrast and saturation, and the second is our color balance. Now, we can turn a node off, and there are two ways to do that. You can either click on the number, and that will turn it off, or you can highlight a node, and then hit Control or Command, and then D, and that will turn the currently active selected node off. If you want to turn every node off and on at once, then hold Alt, and then hit D. Here we can see the before and after of the grade, the raw image, and after we've performed the color grade. This is a bit like a math exercise we used to do in primary school called the function machine, which is essentially a long sum. We've got a starting image, we add 15 to make it brighter, subtract 20 to make it darker, multiply, divide, all of that stuff, and then we end up with a number which represents our final image, kind of. We end up with an enormous series of numbers that represent our final image, but the basic logic is the same. So we're going to talk quickly about how to organize a grade whilst you're working, and this is especially good for people who are beginning in the grade. Now, we can collapse a large number of adjustments and functions into a single node, but when you're just starting out, it actually pays to separate them out into multiple nodes. That way you have a stronger idea of what's actually going on in your grade, and it's easier for you to keep organized as you're working. So what I recommend you do is that you divide your nodes up and you organize by goals. So when I say that, I mean to say that our first node here is our primary contrast and saturation. It doesn't do anything with color balance. So that's our goal. My goal for this first node would be to set my shadows, set my highlights, and set my saturation. We're not going to put anything else in here. We're not going to put any fancy selections or any other secondary curves or anything we haven't covered yet. We're not going to put anything else in here. This node has now served its purpose. We're going to create a new node. Now we can create a new serial node two ways. We can right click in an empty part of the node tree, mouse over add node, and then hit corrector. That'll add a new serial node. That then needs to be added into the current node tree. And to do that, you can drag and drop it on top of the noodle, and it will then insert itself in there. If you want to get rid of a node, highlight the node in the node tree, click it once, and an orange border denotes the currently active node. Then just hit the delete key, and it will go. The easier and quicker way, and more practical way to add a serial node, especially to a linear grade, is simply to hold Alt and hit S for serial. That will automatically add another serial node, and then also add it into the node tree that you're building. You don't have to drag and drop or disconnect a noodle and then drag a new one. If you want to disconnect a noodle, click the right half, the blue part, and then it will disappear. If you want to draw a connection, you click at the starting point, left click, and then you drag, and then you let go on the finishing point on the connection you want to make, and then you've made a connection that way. So, back to the original point. We had two main goals in this primary grade. We wanted to set our contrast and saturation, and then we wanted to set our color balance. So what we do is we do our primary grade, our primary contrast grade, and then when we've done that, we hold Alt and hit S to make a new node, and then in this node, we then do our color balance. So we use the primary wheels to level out the shadows, make them more neutral, level out the sky a little bit, add a bit more warmth to our mids, bring out his skin. We want to be careful, we don't want it to go a weird purple, we don't want the water to look muddy, we don't want the sky to go a rusty colour, so we just need to exercise some restraint here. And it is a cold greyish day. And then a little bit more saturation. Now, if our client comes back and says, well actually I quite like it blue, I don't want you to make it neutrally balanced, rather than go back into our first node and have to manually reset our wheels, all we have to do is click our color balance node, click on the number. You don't have to click on a node and then click the number to deactivate it. You can just click the number directly and it will turn off. Now, as you can see, this is a much more logical and organized way to work. It allows you to maintain tight control of aspects of your grade at all times. It doesn't mean that you have to go back into a node that has, I don't know, 4 or 5 tools working at once and manually drag things back into position, which is a very unreliable way to reset a grade. It allows us to basically work incrementally. We can then add versions, we can add new corrections and submit new versions of this grade to our client and get feedback on that. And then if they don't like it, it's very easy to remove. Or then if they change their mind again later, and that does happen, it's also very easy to reinstate just by, just with a single click, not with a load of having to try and manually repeat steps you've taken before. So this was a decent introduction to the node tree. We're going to be using it constantly from here on out, and as we cover more advanced aspects of organization as well as nonlinear nodes, we'll go into much greater detail with those as we come across them in later projects. When you're ready, click on through to the next lecture. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the automatic color tools within Resolve. Now, these work best when split across multiple nodes. They can be an okay starting point, and then in the next node we can refine it and get it into a good place, and then continue with our grade. So let's just take a look at the auto color tools we have, because they may or may not be any good. If it works, okay? If it gets the job done, that's all that matters when we do this. We're not driven by an honor code in color grading. We just deliver results. So if these tools work, do not shy away from using them, is the point I'm trying to make. I was very aloof about this when I started working. I didn't want to use LUTs. I didn't want to use anything automatic. But now I'm just, well, whatever, let's get the job done and get it to a good standard. It's the same will happen to you as well if you have the same notions about automatic tools. So let's take a look. In the upper left of my primary wheels, and make sure we're back on the primary wheels from the log wheels from the previous lecture, there's a little A in the kind of leftmost side. This is auto balance, and if I click this, it's going to try and grade my shot automatically. Resolve now uses an AI engine to try and do this. It yields mixed results. I often find it can be an okay starting point. So the saturation here is all right. The contrast is too much. So I'm going to bring my lift up a little, and I'm going to bring my highlights down just so, and maybe my mids to about there. And that's a pretty good kind of basic primary grade. I don't like what's happened to his shirt shadow down here. We've got some very hard edges which have appeared as a result of the grade. So let's just see what else we can do there. So because it's an AI driven tool, it can often introduce these little artifacts, and I don't like the shadows, I don't like the highlights there. So let's take a look at the other tools we can use. Next to lift, on the left hand side of lift, I have a little crosshair with a black dot. This is the pick black point option. If I click that, I pick up the crosshair, and what it wants me to do is it wants me to click on an object or click on a region of the image that should be pure black. And his sock down here is a pretty good candidate for that. When I do that, it will set that object, or it will set that selected value down to 0. And it will try to make sure that it is neutral as well. I then have a white crosshair on the left side of gain, and I can click to pick that up, and I will place it over something that should be pure white. And when I do that, it tries to set the highlights there. And then I can play around with my mids. I can try and bring my shadows up a little bit. I can play with my midtones, and then I can bring my saturation up, and that's a passable primary grade. So they can be useful. I very often find they introduce these kind of harsh edges in the shadows, so I don't use them pretty much at all, but if they work for you, they work for you. That's the whole point of this. The last thing we're going to look at is the automatic white balance, and that's just this little kind of white paint drop eyedropper here. I can pick that up, and I click on something that should be pure white, and when I click on that, it basically bounces the image so that whatever I clicked on is pure white. If I click on something that isn't white, it gives some pretty weird and wonderful effects. So I can click on maybe this, and then it tries to make that value neutral by bouncing the rest of the image. That one can actually be quite useful, but it does require that you have an object that is actually pure white in your frame. If you don't have a highlight that's bright enough, or you don't have a true neutral object in the frame, and very often you don't, is the truth, then it's useless, which is kind of the problem with it. So we do use it sparingly, use it only in the appropriate circumstances. And that's pretty much it for these automatic tools. Like I said, if it works, it works. I personally don't like them. I don't like them at all. One thing that we can do, if I go to my node tree, you'll notice that I have an A here for auto color, but it doesn't actually change any of the primary tools. So using the master reset here isn't going to change it. That's why I like to split these grades across multiple nodes. I like to put whatever auto stuff I have going on in the first node, and then in the second node I can try and make it passable. But nothing's ever going to fix these janky shadows introduced by autocolor. That way I can just delete this node. I can just select it and hit backspace to get rid of the autocolor if I want, and then I can do my pick black, pick white, or in fact what I might do on this shot, because pick black is making problems, I might just use pick white over there, and then I'll set my shadows by hand. And that avoids a lot of the problems I was getting with those weird janky shadows in the shirt there. So you don't have to use them all. I do find pick white point more useful of the two, because pick black point, like I said, it just makes these kind of janky shadows happen. So play around with these as much as you see fit. I don't use them very often, to be honest, but it's important that we cover them and cover their use. So once you're done with that, go ahead and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay, so this one's going to be a bit more freeform. We're going to go through a short sequence and we're going to match it up using basic primary grades. We're going to put everything together that we've just covered and we're going to put it into practice. So we're going to start by taking this excerpt from a short film that I graded a while ago, and it's a baked master, so what we're going to do, we're going to use our scene cut detector and bring it into Resolve. So let's just double check this. It should be very simple. That's great. So we're just going to add our cuts to the media pool, make sure they're in the correct bin. Then in the edit panel, we're going to create a new timeline. And then we're just going to bring everything down here. Now I'm actually going to get rid of the first shot in this sequence. And we're just going to grade from this shot here onwards. So let's go straight ahead into the color panel. So I'm not going to do anything too flash this time. The lighting, it's natural lighting, but it's pretty good and it's pretty consistent. Shot on a good camera on a Blackmagic Design Cinecam. Proper good 10-bit footage. Nice BMD log curve. So let's go ahead and start grading. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose my master shot here. I'm going to choose a shot that I'm then going to match everything else up to, and that's the shot I feel gives the best expression of the scene, I guess, or gives the most useful information, and that would probably be this wide shot. So what I'm going to do is put a green flag on this wide shot, and I know that I'm going to grade this first. I'm going to kind of develop my look here, and then I'm going to grade everything else around it to match this shot. So let's get started. So we're just going to keep it dead basic. We're going to set our contrast. Now if we pull everything right up, we start to get odd silvery skin, so we're not going to pull everything right up to the top. It's a bit dark and a bit dingy as well. He's meeting a character who's dealing in dodgy goods. So what we can then do is bring up our saturation. Now as I bring up our master saturation, I want to be careful with the skin tones of the actors here. I don't want them to look like this. This is silly. Whilst I quite like how super colourful the graffiti is, and this film does have quite a cartoonish look to it, I don't want the skin tones to go crazy, and that can't be fixed without a secondary, so I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to bring it back down and say it's about there. Maybe I want to crush the shadows down a little bit in that kind of alleyway, that kind of tunnel in the background. So I'm going to use my curves. And remember, when you open up a curve, make sure it's unganged so you have more control. And I might just bring it down back there. I'm going to sell the idea that it's quite a dark alley and quite a menacing place to meet, even though we've got quite a colourful aesthetic going on. I quite like that juxtaposition. And that's quite simple. It's a bit yellow, a bit warm. I might just add a touch of coolness into those midtones. And looking at my scopes, looking at my parade, that seems pretty good and pretty neutral. I might just warm up my highlights ever so slightly, bring a bit more out of the skin. And I'd say for a basic primary grade, for a first step, that's probably okay. And that's been dead simple. We start with the shadows, then we set our highlights, then our mids, then we go through and we can set our color balance. We can do a little bit more with the curve if we feel that's necessary. And that's nice, dead easy, dead simple. So now I'm going to right click and I'm going to grab a still, and I've always now got a still to refer to. And like I said before, you can copy paste the look on. That's not quite right, but it's close. So we can use that as a starting point. We can tweak the look that we've copied across, or we can start from scratch. So I'm going to tweak the look that we've just copied across. Now looking at this, the highlights are a bit too high, so we can bring those down a bit. Skin tone's a bit more yellow in the other, so I think the blue here is not doing us any favours. Might just push the gamut very, very slightly to yellow to get that match. The hood's matching, the graffiti's matching up nicely. The skin is maybe a little bit lighter in this shot. I might just bring our mids down ever so slightly. That's getting better. And I'll bring my highlights up slightly to compensate. Maybe highlights down ever so slightly now that I look at it. Right, so now what I'll do is I'll play these two back to back and see how they edit together. That edits quite nicely, as far as I can see. So I'm quite happy with that. Again, this is dead basic. This is just basic primary stuff. Shadows, highlights, color balance, saturation, tiny little bit of curves. I might even make the curve adjustment a little bit milder here, because I don't want to lose the detail in the jacket. Let's just give that a look. There we go. I'm quite happy with how those two things edit together. So I'll take another still. And now for shots of the same angle, I can copy that across. I can just middle click or right click and choose apply grade. And now we have an easy match there. Same for this wide at the end. I've got quite an easy match there. Whenever we do this, we always watch it through and make sure that nothing unexpected comes along and interferes. That there's a change in light or the camera settings change partway through a shot. That happens, although it's not common. I'm quite happy with that now. Now, this looks like a similar angle to me, but I don't think copying and pasting across is going to work. You can see how it's much cooler. So I'm going to either have to warm this up or start from scratch, and I'll try and warm this up to compensate. Okay, as I've introduced red into my midtones there, I've also interfered with my shadows. Highlights are a little bit bright. Maybe bring the mids down a smidge. And maybe bring the saturation up further on this one because the colour's not as strong. That looks pretty good to me now. So we're doing a lot of copying and pasting in this one, and if that's appropriate, that's okay. In other cases, we might do a lot more by hand from the ground up, and that's absolutely okay as well. It's about what's appropriate for the project at hand. It's not about doing things a very specific way at all times or having a very specific approach to grading. It's whatever is appropriate. So we're getting there now with our primary grade, and this is a very basic primary grade. This shot is going to be dead easy. We'll just set our contrast. Bring up the saturation. Maybe just watch out for his skin tone there. Okay, our highlights are still a little bit strong on this one, so I'm going to bring them back under control with the curve. And because it's a highlight on her skin, what I might just do is bring the top part of the red channel down using the red curve. Because our red channel was much higher before. Okay, there's a little bit of shine, a specular highlight on the top right of the forehead, but that's not a deal breaker right now, especially when there's this shot in between. If we watch all this through, or if we watch these 3 shots through in sequence, maybe what we can do is bring down that highlight with the log wheel, just leave it at 33, or just leave high range at 550. And now we've got a much stronger match. Let's watch that through again. So we've only got a few shots left to grade. This one should be fairly simple. Make sure that you don't leave your color wheels in log. Make sure you've hit this dot here, and that you go back into your primaries, because if you start grading in log, it's going to look very odd, and it's not going to respond the way you expect. Now we do have a point of absolute white here. We have a strong specular highlight on the wall there, but we could ignore that a little bit, and we can bring that back under control using a curve in a second. Okay, brightness, that's looking good. Let's bring up our saturation again. Now again, I don't want him to look like an Oompa Loompa. I'm going to say maybe 72, 73 is good there. It's also a good match for the skin in the wide. When we're matching things together, when we're looking at different shots, we're not just looking at shots, one shot next to the other. We're looking at the kind of consistency throughout the entire scene. This is very important. So I'm still keeping an eye on his skin tone here compared to here. And I might just bring things down on the Luma curve slightly, and then I might just bring that highlight back under control. And that's looking pretty good to me. Let's just watch that through. Side by side, these stand up pretty well. Maybe the shadows in his shirt are a little bit off. Looking at it, we can just neutralize those a little bit. Maybe bring this down a bit so they're a bit blacker. There we go. Now, we'll take another still. We don't necessarily take a still of every single shot we grade, but in this case I've taken one still to reflect a different angle. So I have A, a handy method for comparison, and B, something I can use to copy the grade across if I need to. So I'm going to go on and finish off the rest of this sequence now. In this case, this is a close-up of a different angle. We could try and copy across, and it's worked fairly well. It is a little bit different. We have more of the frame is blown out here, so we need to bring that down. I'm going to use the offset wheel here. And I just need to be careful of making the shadows too dark. And that's looking pretty good to me in terms of matching. Now these two are more or less standalone, but we need to make sure that they fit into the rest of the sequence, and we're just going to set our contrast quite simply. And whack up the saturation, make sure we get that nice purple shirt and those skin tones in there. can see that we've got a bit of a red highlight issue, so I'm just going to go with, in on the red curve. Bring that back under control ever so slightly. And I can try copying across, and that's not right, so we'll do this one from scratch. If you want to reset all your grades, you hold Control or Command and hit the Home key, and that will take your shot right back to its starting point and delete all the nodes on your node tree for that shot, or for any shots selected in the thumbnail list down here. So we'll just do this properly. Whilst I do want some blue on the banknotes, I do want the white to be white, so we'll just balance that out a bit more. There we go. Then bring up our saturation. And that's pretty good. So now we're going to watch our entire sequence through. We'll save the project. And we'll see what we think. So I can see a number of secondary grades that I would make on this already, but we're not covering those just yet. We'll come back to this with secondaries in mind. Okay, that shot seems a little bit epic when we cut to it. So what I probably want to do here is bring these highlights down and bring the midtones up and make sure that make it so that the contrast isn't quite as harsh. I mean, his face was very high contrast in comparison to hers just then, and we've just softened that out a bit, so let's now take another look at this. Okay, that's better, but still a little bit bright. Let's go back, let's take another look. That's a much better edit to me. It's still a touch on the bright side, so let's just see if we can bring it down even a little bit more. That's a much better edit now. And that's just what it takes, really. It just needs you to keep looking and keep making little tweaks until you finally get it right. That's all. We've gone through this quite quickly. It's quite a simple... And I've spotted an error there. It's quite a simple sequence, but we've got a missed cut here. This was an edit which was missed by the scene cut detector, so what we're going to do is make sure that we get that right. We'll just move the playhead. We're back here in the edit panel, and we're just going to move the playhead to the point at which the edit changes, and then we're going to make a cut. And we'll grade this up to match everything else, because it wasn't taking the grade from the previous shot particularly well. Let's just take a little bit of that warmth down. Oops, wrong shot. Well, I'm going to say this quite a few times. What we're going to do is watch the whole thing through twice. Whenever we deliver, whenever we think we've finished, we watch it through twice in succession. That way we minimize the number of things that we miss. We need to make sure that we watch it through twice and that we're really paying attention. Watch it again, you'll notice some errors that you didn't spot before. So we're just going to watch this all through 2 times. Okay, those shadows seem a little bit harsh on this. You can see now we've got some really odd stuff going on under his chin and in his mouth. So what we're going to do is bring our shadows up. And maybe our mids down, our highlights back up ever so slightly. And this is why we watch through all the time. There we go, that's much better. Okay. Maybe we'll bring them down ever so slightly. Cool. Now this is the last time we're watching it through. Okay, this shot still sticks out to me as being just a little bit... Yeah, what I want to do is bring it down but avoid that odd shadow on his neck and his mouth, so I can just bring the mids down a little bit more. Okay, I will bring this down ever so slightly. It seems a little bit... So what I will do is I'll bring these shadows down ever so slightly. Make sure we have the same grounding in these shots as we have in others. Excellent. Cool. Right, I'm going to watch this through one more time, but I'll edit that out just so we don't spend loads of time just waiting around, really. So this was a very simple sequence. On some basic projects, this would be enough. If you're on a very tight deadline, you could then just get everything so that it matches together. There's some slight lighting mismatches here, which are quite easy to iron out, and just try and get the best out of the scene we can as quickly as possible. We're going to come back to this same sequence at the end of the secondary module and do another pass at it using our secondary tools, doing work with particular colours in the background, on the shirt, on the skin, making sure that our shadows are just so. We're going to do a more advanced pass on this later on. So save this project because we are going to come back to it later on when we do the secondary, when we match up a sequence using secondary qualifications. Right, I hope you enjoyed this. Click on through to the next lecture and the next module once you're ready.